Oh my goodness.
Afternoon.
Our break.
Welcome. We're here to explore the intersection of identity and DLTs or blockchains in general. I actually have good news. We're done. Facebook came out last week and announced Libra. And as part of the white paper, they indicated that they are going to define an identity standard. So we're good, right? We can wrap this up. Just saved you an hour. Actually not. Maybe there's value in us trying to tease out some of the subtleties of DLTs and ledgers. I'm Paul Madsen. I spent many years at Ping working on identity. I thought I was out of identity. I moved to a ledger startup called Hedera. But I'm back to identity because of the possible value proposition that ledgers provide to identity, which I think is what we're trying to explore here today. The other angle, of course, is that identity is relevant to ledgers, right? Lots of accounts on crypto platforms require KYC. But I think that's less interesting. And I think my intent, at least, is to focus on the first proposition. Are DLTs a useful piece of infrastructure for identity use cases? So to explore that, maybe I can ask the panel to suggest what are the fundamental challenges in identity? And then we can ask ourselves, do DLTs help with that? Thomas, you're nodding.
Well, we're going in sequence, right?
No.
This is
decentralized, right? This is a leaderless protocol.
This is a setup, guys. So if I fall down, you'll see. I tried to understand. We try in our group. So back up a little bit. I belong to a group at MIT that does a lot of social analytics research. Probably the top group on the planet when it comes to doing social analytics. We look at the identity problem as two buckets, right? So you see me yesterday talk about right side, left side, two buckets. The one bucket, I talk about managing identifiers. So all the stuff, all the protocols, SAML, OpenID Connect, DIDs, public keys, these are all identifiers. So my public is not my identity. My credit card is not my identity. My social security number is not my identity. So that's the first bucket. Second bucket, the real issue for identity is data, personal data, right? So yesterday, Prati from Microsoft gave one of the best presentations on the IDs I've seen. Wonderful. Where is she?
Right in front.
And at the corner, there's this company.
Well, to be fair, there's only ever been two presentations.
Okay. Well, I've seen YouTubes and all that stuff. But at the corner there was a company that was issuing assertions, claims, Contorso. So that is the second problem. So when you see somebody giving an assertion, how do you know that the company or the entity is using accurate data? Where did they have the data? Did I have a say into it? Are the algorithms fair? Because this whole fairness question in machine learning is a big deal, right? So people are discovering that algorithms to do AI have inbuilt biases, and there is no such thing also as neutral data. Every raw data set has inbuilt bias, right? So I put that in the second bucket, and the question is, how do you bridge between the two? So using Prati's example, if I apply for a home loan and I go to somebody to get an assertion or multiple assertions, that's the data bucket, right? That's the problem. And if you can bridge it to, then you might have a solution to the identity problem, because my identity is a collection of all my data, my personal data, right? And so we talk about personas. I have a social life persona. I have a work persona. Those are just slices of the personal data pie that pertains to me.
So what I heard you say was that the fundamental challenge is assessing the trustworthiness, the LOA of an identity assertion. I don't think ledgers help with that fundamental proposition, right? We have trust frameworks, and we've struggled with that challenge. Garbage in, garbage out for a ledger, right? It's really good at recording the time at which you added the garbage, but it's not very good at assessing whether or not the information was garbage. Now you're nodding or shaking your head.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I mean, clearly biased. I come at this from, I started out my legal career as a data protection and privacy lawyer, sort of cross-border practicing in London and in DC as well. And so it was only in the last, only 4 years or so that I've been pretty deeply involved in blockchain and DLT, which sometimes feels like dinosaur years. So now I come at this from the intersection of data protection and privacy and distributed ledger technology. And in my view, the biggest challenge, the biggest issue has been that in identity, I think we've traditionally come at this from an overly technical standpoint and from an overly technical perspective. And I think what we're seeing very clearly, particularly over the last year or two, is that these issues that exist in the digital ecosystem go well beyond technology and the technical. And they are commercial challenges, they are legal challenges, they are cultural challenges, they are social challenges. And so we have this sort of tradition and culture and history of creating, very technical approaches and solutions to identity, DLT being one of them, but dealing with issues that go way beyond that. And so one of the really interesting trends that I've seen emerging in the DLT space is how many people are getting involved in conversations about governance, right? About law, about regulation, about business models and economics. So I think the DLT is an interesting piece in terms of technological innovation, and bits and pieces of it certainly are new and innovative, but I think it's really what it's driving in terms of this convergence around all these different fields that are really demanding to be solved concurrently.
To that point, in a session yesterday, Maria in our track argued that for her the biggest value that ledgers had brought was it got people in the room. I hope we can do better than that. I've joined a startup on that proposition. Ankur, what are your thoughts?
I think what Elizabeth says resonates the most out of this, right? So my role on the Microsoft team is to grow our identity business. And the question that started this work, Preeti and I are on the same team, was how many humans does Microsoft touch? Because our mission statement is to empower every person, and we can't answer that without violating a whole bunch of laws, if you will. What we have is a whole bunch of accounts. So it's a set of digital accounts. We have 800 million monthly active users on Microsoft account and 20 million businesses. But how many people do we touch? Can't tell. And that's what started this work around decentralized identity work for us, to empower every person to own their own identity, versus what we give today as a technology is a bunch of accounts. And there's a big difference between the two, as Thomas was just describing, between my identity and what my accounts stand for. And it goes to what Elizabeth says, is what we have provided is a technical answer, not a human one, that I understand as a normal person. And all of us, none of us needed to be told, you have a digital identity. I have an identity today. What others get to give is attestations or endorsements to say, I'm an engineer, or I work at Microsoft, or whatever. And we don't have a good vocabulary to easily have this conversation, right? And we talk about protocols and relying parties and IDPs and all these acronyms soup, which then results in, oh, you granted consent to Cambridge Analytica to do whatever. And how do you prove any of it? That's not a normal conversation. Does that make sense?
I think it does. George, in your session yesterday, you came at SSI, self-sovereign identity, from the relying party's point of view. Does SSI solve a problem that RPs have?
So I'll connect that question with your first question about the biggest challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges is actually user experience, right? Which touches on a lot of the things that we've addressed already in this conversation. And so from a relying party perspective, it's how do you make that user experience meaningful and simple and understandable to the user? In that context, for a lot of relying parties, relying parties have a continuum of needs as it relates to identity. I'll call them attributes, right? Or verifiable claims, if we want to use the DLT term. And that is, some don't really care at all, right? They're perfectly fine with self-asserted attributes. right? Some have legal reasons for needing, stronger levels of identity proof. But in reality, at the end of the day, what they need is something that they can sort of verify is the same person or same entity that was there before, and that associated, strongly bound to that entity is some set of verifiable claims. Maybe they're self-asserted, maybe they're issued via the fuzzy, undefined trust governance stuff that needs to exist for that to really work. But I think in that context, those are the elements that are critical for relying parties, and DLT can be a mechanism for delivering that, but I don't think it's a requirement or something that necessarily solves that problem in a way that's uniquely better for users.
So as you described it, you don't care. You're a relying party. You don't really care how the attributes flow to you. You just want the attributes you've deemed necessary with a certain level of confidence and provenance. And DLTs maybe help there?
Well, I think it's undefined at this point whether they make a substantially better technical mechanism for delivering that set of data or not. And I would say a little bit to your point, I don't know that we own the attributes, right? I think that the goal of the sort of identity and intersection of identity and DLT is the ability to choose when to present attributes that potentially somebody else owns and has given to me and allowing me to present them. I don't know that I own my driver's license.
That's right.
Right? But the state of Virginia has given it to me and allows me to present it when I want. And I think that model is a model that humans understand. So I don't have issues with that kind of a model. But the aspect of is DLT required for that kind of a model, I think, is...
When I destroyed my passport, the government of Canada reminded me that I do not own that passport. So to that point, is sovereign, self-sovereign, is that the right word? Is that the right term? And I don't mean to be contentious, right? It has a brand and it's been a useful brand, but is it the best way to describe the model?
So I'll jump in on that one. We work with, so of those 20 million customers that run on Azure Active Directory, a whole bunch of them are governments around the world. And when they heard about our investment in decentralized space and the idea around SSI, they're like, are you going to empower 7 billion anarchists? And we're just like, no, that's a political construct. And there's a governance framework that runs on top of it that describes what your sovereignty's domain is. If you want to declare your own constitution and own Bill of Rights, like a privacy statement that you can issue and then have governance around it, knock yourself out. However, in today's world, that's an attribute or a claim, just like Virginia gives you, like you can drive, it comes with you can vote and you owe taxes or whatever else it might be. So SSI is a far broad-reaching construct on how it will apply, TBD, as nation states decide to participate around it. But it's hard to go and dictate like a technology can somehow enable you to have all these legal implications that come with sovereignty, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I spend a lot of my time talking to governments about this, trying to explain what SSI is, trying to explain what DLT-enabled digital identity is. Governments are absolutely allergic to the term self-sovereign, and I think it's deeply misleading because I think in reality, a lot of the verifiable credentials are going to be the conventional ones that are coming from actual governments. So, driver's licenses and passports being two very obvious examples of that. It's the way that they're being leveraged and the way that they're being utilized that's very different and innovative in this space. From my perspective as a data protection and privacy lawyer, I think the two core innovations that I try and highlight around DLT-enabled identity management are reducing correlation risk, right? I think there's a big opportunity there potentially because you're avoiding the sort of phone home problem to minimize correlation across different parties in the ecosystem, which is obviously of a benefit to the individual and is also just more efficient, right, in reducing a lot of risk and overhead from parties having to sort of go back and actually there's an interjection happening here. But I think that's really the core innovation is that, it's kind of the way it works now, right, in the real world. And people ask all the time, what's the liability, or what happens if something goes wrong? And if you think about it now, and you're starting a new job, and you've got to fill out your paperwork for HR, and you bring in your passport, you bring in driver's license, and you have this sort of multi-source composite identity that you form with different documentation depending on who you are and what your circumstances are and what you can produce. And then the employer is under sort of legal requirements to document and verify, and then ultimately destroy or comply with different laws and regulations that apply to the information. And so you present it once, and then you sort of you're onboarded, and you've got your employee ID now, and you don't have to come in and present your passport and driver's license every day. And so it's really this idea of minimizing the points of data collection and data replication, and then also avoiding the correlation across different issuers and relying parties.
So Elizabeth, you talked about inhibiting correlation as a feature. Is that not a feature of the verified claims model and not the DLT itself?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the implementation. Obviously, there are many DID methods out there, and there are different implementations of ledgers in the identity context. For me, it's certainly sort of a layer 2. So I think what's happening is the DLT, the ledger, is enabling that sort of cryptographic trust to ensure that the credential has been validly issued by the relevant issuer, that it hasn't been revoked. And then adding on top of that, you have sort of this verifiable credentials ecosystem where the actual exchanges of information are happening. But I think that one is sort of buffering the other.
So I want to speak a little bit to the correlation, because I think there's a idealistic view around correlation, and there's a pragmatic view, right? And
George, can you define the risk first?
I'm sorry?
Define correlation. What are we trying to inhibit?
So I think from a correlation perspective, right, the goal is that when I interact with OpenTable, and then I interact with Spotify, and then I go to my Capital One bank, right, that those three can't sort of collude behind the scenes and get more information about me, is generally the high-level correlation risk that exists. And I think the problem is from a relying party perspective, from a business perspective, there's a big hurdle in basically saying, I am not going to have any way to either recover the user's account or communicate with the user that is in some sort of persistent manner, right, as simple mechanisms, right? So when we rolled out OpenID and OpenID Connect, right, and we were trying to bootstrap that entire ecosystem, right, it was easy to get the Googles and the AOLs and the Yahoos to sort of come on board to say, we'll be an identity provider, because their skin in the game was small. Trying to get relying parties to adopt was hard. And getting the relying parties to adopt, they had two requirements. I need a verified email address, and I need a verified phone number, both of which are globally correlatable identifiers. So there's a pragmatic aspect here that if I go and I need a strong identity proof to get a loan or to open a bank account, they're going to need my address and my name and my phone number and all these things, which means they can correlate around me. So I think that aspect of it is not a strong aspect. I think the model of basically saying I'm presenting some set of attributes, I'm sort of choosing the attributes that I want to present, and it's a negotiation with the relying party because they're going to have their set of attributes they want, and that becomes a negotiation and becomes therefore more transparent. I think there's value in that from the model perspective, whereas today it's sort of the relying party says, give me this, and you're sort of in an all or nothing state, and maybe driving this other kind of a model will either create different levels of service within a relying party. I think that's questionable, but possible.
And clearly some UX considerations with the implication of users trying to negotiate and legal. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, Elizabeth, revocation as a piece. Thomas and I were chatting before this session, and that came up. Thomas, you famously published a post last year, Identity is Broken. Can you tie together those threads?
Sure. So yes, so if you Google Wall Street Journal, April last year, my name and Pentland, you'll see that article. But and yes, we questioned the naming of self-sovereign, and we suggested a different name, which is a community sovereign identity or joint sovereign. And the reason is because individuals live in communities. I mean, we live in towns. My town hall guys know me, the Starbucks guys know me, the Dunkin' guys know me, CVS knows me, right? So if I want to go to a bank, I go to the Bank of America in my town, even though at MIT there is a big one just next to my building. Why? Because I know the guys in town, right? So we need to leverage that. So in fact, I could even say that my identity, the data about me, is held together by my community. And so the digital representation of the community interactions, let me repeat that. I'm in a community, I interact with members. There's a community interaction network. The digital representation of that network defines my identity in that context, right? Yeah, so that's in the Wall Street Journal paper. And because we said we should call it community sovereign, I kind of became unpopular in certain circles. I hope they will accept me back, wink wink. So we were talking today about certificate revocation. So one of the classic problems in X509 certificates, way back in so bit of disclosure, I worked for VeriSign back in the mid-90s, the early day of VeriSign. It became the largest certificate authority on the planet. We did the root case search for the Microsoft, I think not just IE, but the code signing, we did that, probably still do. I was in charge of the X509 for cable modems, for the TPM hardware that goes into all these, whole bunch of stuff. So one of the key problems is that when I discover that my private key has been compromised, I lose my phone and so on, I need to notify somebody very quickly. Because if that key is used to sign a contract, according to the Digital Signature Act of 2000, it will stand in court, right? So how do I do this? So notify the CA, right? So there is a protocol, which is a number of protocols, but the other side, the CA will run a server called an OCSP responder server, Online Certificate Status Protocol Responder. It's all standardized, it's all RFCs, you just Google it. And we were saying that, well, instead of having a server responder, could it be a blockchain, a DLT? And so the question is, how fast is DLT? Because it's going to be a race between me issuing, a flag, at least a notification, and the bad guy signing the contract. Right. So is a DLT a faster solution than an OCSP responder? That's a TBD. Depends on the DLT. Certainly not Bitcoin. I mean, 6-7 transactions per second. I love the Bitcoin guys, but okay, that's not fast enough.
Or maybe you have a very slow attacker.
I was hoping the hash graph would help me out here.
Thanks for the plug.
I think the self-sovereign is coming from this desire for more autonomy, right? I think it's coming from the impulse of just like all of sort of decentralized web and Web3 is this impulse to move away from the sort of locus of control and have to go through, the large intermediary. I think there's something, to be said for that. I think the terminology probably isn't doing us any favors, but I think we're starting to understand what we all mean, by this, and it's meant to be sort of an alternative model.
So I have a question there, right? Because we talk about the current model as being very centralized, but in reality, how many people use only one identity provider in their life? Does anybody use only a single identity provider?
Yes, Facebook? No.
Well, no. So some people. Well, but I mean, I've got Yahoo accounts and Google accounts and Facebook accounts and AOL accounts and plus probably hundreds of direct site accounts. So I don't know that our current model is actually centralized.
So I wouldn't say centralized or decentralized. I think it's around autonomy. So largely you have to input, username and password. Largely you have to use email and phone number. These things are all, individually correlatable. And I think it goes to where the data is and sort of what the access points are. And I think that's why we see, law and regulation moving strongly in favor of things like data portability in terms of access, in terms of transparency and rights to information. So it's not, I think that centralized, decentralized can be a red herring sometimes. I think in the real world, things are pretty decentralized, and often that creates a lot of the inefficiencies and friction. And so I think it's more around what's the impact on the individual in terms of their ability to actually exercise sort of these,
I think there's we oversimplify the scenarios when we confound to just about centralization, right? So there is a user notion around control, like GDPR is nice, but how many in the audience know how many websites you went to since January 1? And then you gotta find the GDPR button. After that, you hope and pray that they gave you everything that you hope was in there. So that's step one. The second one is, it's not I have one switch, but there's 4. It's not hundreds, there's 4. And you turn 4 switches off and you are gone from the digital universe. And it's done over and over again in political realms or other reasons. Microsoft gets those requests from various governments around the world, and that doesn't live up to our mission statement for empower every person if I have a key somewhere that gives your email to somebody or otherwise. Right? So that's a different challenge, right, around control of users or organizations. And then there is a third one around privacy of who can correlate what and what control do I have in playing with it. And one can say, hey, if you accepted my terms of service, you are trading that for the value. But that's not an equitable or understandable trade, because part of that consent is an informed one, and I can't understand any of those, and I do this for a living.
So
right?
You know, from a privacy perspective, transparency is huge. But from, you know, sort of an identity and a DLT perspective, as a relying party, when you come and I say, I request from you, you know, taking DDoS or some other sort of mechanism, right? And I say, I request from you first name, last name, date of birth, phone number, right? And those are the things that I, as a relying party, require. I'm going to get those, right? I'm going to leverage them, right? So now I have a DID, and I have this other information that I can use potentially for account recovery, because I'm not going to, as a relying party, I'm not going to trust that you will correctly back up your keys and do all the right stuff, right? So I have that data anyway, so you're still going to have to come back to me, remember that I'm there, and go and say, please delete my data at the relying party. There isn't a global, you know, delete my data switch.
We should disambiguate between those again, right? I am also one of the largest relying parties in the world with Outlook and Xbox and Windows and whatever else. And we've spent 2.5 years doing our GDPR compliance work, and my CISO and CTO and CIOs are very worried. Even after being GDPR compliant, we are one USB stick away from just being screwed. And so is the other 20 million customers who run on Azure Active Directory. So one of the things we have realized is that, yes, I needed that data at once upon a time to do enrollment, registration, some value that I needed to give you. But I don't need durable access to it. I do need to enable you to do key recovery. I do need to give you a mechanism to identify yourself so I can give you predictable value, if you will. But this is not the way necessarily to do it. So we are finding new ways to see if we can solve the problem without the current challenges.
So even if you say, I don't need the initial set of attributes that give me assurance that you're a good person, which could be, in Thomas's case, a reputational score of your community, right? I'm still, as a relying party, I'm providing you a service. So we talked last session when we were talking about Spotify, right? And the personalization and the collecting of data to personalize your music stream, right? That is still something that Spotify will have. They need to store it. They need to manage it. You're still going to have to go back to Spotify. Remember you use Spotify and say, please delete my data. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is that I don't know that the sort of like identity presentation of attribute mechanism of DLT necessarily makes that problem simpler. I still have a unique relationship, ideally with a pseudonymous identifier with each relying party.
So to that point, let's talk about what goes on the ledger and what should never go on the ledger, right? Because as George points out, even in the self-sovereign model, the user interacts directly against the relying party and presents some attributes, some claims they got elsewhere. The DLT is not involved directly.
Yep.
So if the attributes themselves shouldn't go on the ledger, what should go on the ledger?
I just want to make a point about this, because one thing that's emerged as sort of a consensus in this space is that you don't put personal data on the ledger, but then often in the next sentence you hear, but the DIDs are anchored to the ledger. And those two statements are really interesting as a data protection and privacy lawyer, because identity information is de facto personal data, right? It's designed to identify. That's what personal data is. And so DIDs are, of course, decentralized identifiers, and therefore they're personal data. And I think that's also now emerging as a consensus. And so if someone says, we don't put personal data on the ledger, and then they say they put DIDs on it, be cautious about that conclusion. Now, that's not to say that there is any hard and fast legal consensus around the extent to which that can be workable. I think we know that we should minimize, to the greatest extent possible, the personal data that does go on the ledger. And the ideal would be to not have any. But to the extent that we have some mechanism for anchoring DIDs to a ledger, the question becomes things around, what is sufficiently anonymized data, right? How many, if you have thousands of DIDs, right, are those, and they're not correlatable across contexts, and they're all in the context of pairwise relationships, is that something that's now, has that been sufficiently anonymized in a given context? Can it be effectively erased? All of these questions. So I think for me, it's not so helpful to talk about whether personal data goes on the ledger. It's around the whole architecture of what is the interaction between the off-ledger points and the rest of the architecture and the stack. Where is the actual data stored? What are the DID documents pointing to? So you have to look at it from a sort of macro, holistic perspective. I think in reality, if you want to use DLT for identity management, you're going to end up having some challenges around the intersection of personal data and data protection laws and the technology itself.
So I stand corrected for my oversimplistic question. Thomas, you were nodding.
Sure. So this, bear in mind, this is Horizon 2, Horizon 3. You guys know H1, H2, H3, right? So this is 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years now. So one of the projects we have is called Open Algorithms, and the idea is that and I mentioned this yesterday, that really data repositories should never ever export data, no matter what. So, and instead, you send the algorithm to the endpoint, the data, and execute there and return, results. So, one of the projects we're doing with students is, could some of these algorithms be represented as smart contracts on a blockchain, assuming the blockchain supports smart contracts, so that I could see could be in Python, pick a language. I could actually see the algorithm. It's got signatures of the vetting entities or authorities saying, okay, this algorithm will compute credit score if it's given the following data sets, right? So this is H2, H3 stuff, right? And so that's one possible use, so that instead of talking about claims and attributes that are sort of static, right? You could talk about dynamic attributes, so that if I want to do a home loan, as Pratik was saying yesterday, I could say, well, look, here's my data set here. Here's algorithm number 5, number 31, and number 51 on a blockchain. Run it, and it'll yield an answer, and that's my assertion. That's the way I am today, because my credit score 6 months ago and today might be different, right? And that's just using the credit score example that we're familiar with, right? And that doesn't solve the problem of how did Equifax get my data in the first place, right? That's another sort of panel.
Yeah, is that as you described it, is that an identity use case or a business process transparency use case?
It's more of automating some of the business processes and then tying it to an identity system. This is left side, right side, first bucket, second bucket. This is a second bucket problem.
We still need to know who
That's
participated,
right. That's right. Like
even though it's
that's a very good. So if you send in, what do you send into this? What's the index? Social security number?
Yeah.
So this is why it's H2, H3 stuff. This is, we're early days.
Who had 20 minutes in the pool for first mention of GDPR? Because Ankur, you hit 20 minutes. So part of GDPR is right to be forgotten. How do we reconcile that with immutability?
So I think this is perceived as the biggest challenge in respect of GDPR and distributed ledger. I don't take that view. I think there is precedent from the Article 29 Working Party, which is the predecessor to the current European Data Protection Supervisor, on erasure where it's sort of what we call effective erasure, because often in the digital realm there really is no such thing as absolute erasure of all the forensics that go along with with the digital footprint. I think we will see some kind of guidance from the European Commission in the next, 9 months to a year around what constitutes effective erasure in this space. I think certainly minimizing the amount of personal data that goes on the ledger helps with this. It's also easier, obviously, in context of IoT or where it's not personal data that's implicated. I think the really big challenges that are very underappreciated right now are around things like a restriction of processing, which is reversible, right? Or things like consent, where someone revokes their consent. I think also around cross-border transfers of data is a very big one. So very few ledgers have seemed to consider that you need a valid mechanism for transferring data out of a given jurisdiction. That's not just in the EU, that's across the world, and various jurisdictions that have either localization requirements or data transfer restrictions. And so if you've got particularly in the context of a public permissionless ledger where you can, where the nodes are replicated anywhere and everywhere, there's sort of automatic transfers that are happening there. They're most likely not going to be compliant with the relevant law or regulation. So, that's something that might be subject to automation. There might be a way to automate some of the rules around that. But I think there are much more complex challenges than just the erasure piece. It's certainly a big one, but again, I think there will be guidance that comes out from the Commission.
So you mentioned permission versus permissionless. Is that relevant here? Is it a simpler model if it's permissioned?
Yeah, so I think it's relevant for a number of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is it helps identify who the relevant players are in terms of the data controller, the data processor, sub-processors. So something like a GDPR model is architected around accountability, and accountability is a core principle. And part of accountability, of course, is being able to identify those parties that will be held accountable for compliance with the relevant details of the law and regulation, also for giving effect to data subject rights. So I think the biggest challenge in the permissionless context has been this idea of who do we hold accountable, but it also helps in terms of this idea of baking something in like network rules that comply with cross-border transfers, because you can have sort of a more deliberate and conscious effort around the participants in the permission network coming together to actually design something like that.
Indeed.
As it sits today, so we're working with a number of other industries on this as we try to build this, and the expectation of Microsoft is you're going to stand by an SLA for this. And part of that service level agreement is who is accountable for what. And so we're working with our lawyers and other companies' lawyers to go back to the regulators to go and verify their point of view or clarify their point of view, depending on how you think about it, on the law was conceived when data subject rights were distinct from data controller and data processor responsibility. In this scheme, we are saying there is this identity hub where the user or some entity gets to own and control that data, and they have the switch that turns access on and off to it. At which point, if I am a relying party who gave you that data, what is my obligation to that thing, and how do I enforce it, and how I live up to it? So we're trying to go back to regulators and clarify that point of view to say, okay, in a world where a data subject has a mechanism to assert control, what are the obligations and how does it work?
But the law has dealt with this before, so there's a lot of guidance and precedent from the ISP context and from other sort of semi-decentralized distributed contexts as well, where you're sort of only responsible to the extent that you have control. And so in the context where, so for example, with the data controller determining the purpose and means of processing, so you might determine the means but not the purpose, right? Or you might determine the purpose and the means, or you might jointly determine those things. And so the law has a mechanism for allocating relative to sort of what aspects you're controlling. So for example, if someone has, a personal data store, or they've got, their digital wallet, and they've got their claims and their credentials stored in there, and they're interacting with folks, and the wallet provider, right, or the agent, the intelligent agent provider doesn't have access to the data itself, they're still controlling something about the purpose and means of processing. And so you go to the sort of the next level of what are they actually responsible for, and allocate liability in that way.
It's the ones where we get into more complex flows like delegation or transfer of agency taking place, right? And we're doing encryption using each other's keys, and what did I have access to versus the other party, and whose obligations there are the ones that are trickier flows to tie that down. And are you really an identity provider? Because yes, it's under ISP, but I think I'm providing an identifier Identity comes from those claims that come from another place. So these are the kinds of things where we are at the early stage, right? This is an emerging standards conversation, not an open standards conversation. And part of that standards definition is getting to clarity on how we interpret that intention and what are the obligations from it. And we don't have good clarity on that yet.
Ankur, what's the motivation for side tree and ion?
Yeah, it goes to somebody mentioned earlier on the scale at which the systems work. So to the degree that you're minting coins, you need consensus for the world to agree on that fungible asset, if you will. Identity doesn't have a double spend problem. And so our intention is, and hypothesis is that by having a layer 2 on top of this DLT, you can have an identity operation that says there's a unique key that is in possession of this identifier. And then you can memorialize it on a DLT, distributed ledger technology of your choice, per whatever their consensus algorithm is. And then you can use that to do signing activities against it. And so ION, as you mentioned, is an internet overlay network, is a reference implementation of side tree protocol that the Decentralized Identity Foundation community came up with as a layer 2 protocol for identity-related operations. Transmute is another company who's implemented side tree for Ethereum called Element. And there will be other flavors, right? But the motivation behind that was to address performance and scale needs that identity operations may have, which are far greater than 7 a minute. That just doesn't work.
So it's the DID registration methods that are to some extent are batched and sent on.
That's right. And then we have to then address other key problems like recovery and revocation that occurs in that world, right? So far we've addressed registration. Next thing we're going to go work towards is revocation and recovery that could be self-owned, if you will, where you're not going to a centralized system to do that, going to that other relying party need, right? So that's another hard problem in this space. Performance and scale was one. The other one is key recovery. And how do you not have scraps of paper in Cayman Islands? Because that's the only bank that's making money in that case.
How do we put SSI in context, right? This to some extent is the latest architecture that this room and this conference, this community has come up with. There's been SAML, there's been OpenID Connect, WSFed, et cetera. They're all protocols that are ultimately trying to do the same thing. Is this just the latest reincarnation? Or is there something novel and unique here?
I think it's an evolution, right? And so tomorrow, Alex from our team is doing a talk on those waves, in fact, describing those protocols. They've solved specific problems at specific points in time. And I don't think it's an or, I think it's an and. It's augmenting these protocols. That's another thing that we argue in the community around is our point of view on Microsoft is very much that this is an evolution and we have to augment existing systems as opposed to rip and replace. Because we're not waiting for our new internet to be born with whole new stuff, right? So it's about stepping up progressively depending on the level of risk you carry. You can choose to say, fill out a form and I'll give you value, or I want verifiable claims, and there's a whole gradient in between. So these protocols support various levels of gradation, if you will.
I guess from a relying party perspective, it's another federation protocol with potentially different characteristics, right? So I think the user experience is different, and that's actually can be a very good thing, right? It can be an evolution of user experience benefits, but at the end of the day, from a relying party perspective, I'm creating a relationship with the entity that's talking to me, right? And I'm effectively externalizing the authentication or the proof of that entity in some manner. Right, and that's sort of, it's a different way of doing it, but I don't know that it changes fundamentally what's being done in those other ways.
Right.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned federated identity because I think there's an assumption that SSI means it's decentralized or it's sort of level 3 after federated, and I think in some ways it's the most centralized. It's just that it's centralized around the individual, right? It's centralized around me now. I'm now federating my own identity, and so I think that's the real paradigm shift, is sort of who's at the focal point, who's at the nexus of control. And yeah, I agree that it's an evolution. I think that many of us probably recognize that you can have SSI without DLT, right? But it's sort of a step in that direction. And I think it goes hand in hand with all the other things we see emerging around personal data stores, and again, just sort of moving the locus of control. But yeah, I think probably in 5 years DLT will be replaced by something else, and so it's sort of what sort of principles do we extract and carry forward that are going to sort of restore some of the balance between individuals and entities.
Let's hope it's not 5. Shall we open it up? Does anybody have any questions from the floor?
I think somebody in the middle there.
I see a hand up through the glare.
So from a GDPR point of view, if it's a self-sovereign identity, how does consent, a right to forget, all that change?
We're going to need a few hours. So it doesn't really, so it depends what flavor of SSI, right? And it depends what you're doing, what the context is. It doesn't really change the paradigm that much. I think if you go back to, so the nice thing about the GDPR is the principles-based regulation, so it's not highly prescriptive, and it's meant to be technology neutral. I mean, we've seen the limitations of that. But actually, if you approach it more from a principles basis, I think it's not actually as complicated, but it has to be contextual. So it really goes down to who are the participants, what can they control relative to each other, what's the basis for the processing. Consent is one of many bases for processing, right? And it's sort of disfavored at this point in many contexts. So I think we have to look to sort of go back to the intent and the spirit of the law in every sense, and solve for what it was intended to solve for.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Elizabeth because we have a lawyer here. I'm over here.
Oh.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah, so as user attributes become more and more portable, right, and they have a sort of a globalization effect to them, can be transferred from organization to organization, what are the legal implications to this? Because it used to be these attributes are kind of internal elements that we used to authorize within our own enterprise or maybe a small network of them, but they can become more sovereign, so to speak. Is there any existing case law that says that if this user has an attribute that they are a doctor, they go on an airplane, they're authorized to, I don't know, some special procedure to help a passenger or something? What's the case law? Any culpability, this kind of direction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So data portability is becoming a near universal core principle of many and right in many jurisdictions. So it's certainly ubiquitous at this stage. What we've seen is a lot of technical data portability, but not so much legal data portability, and it's for that exact reason that we don't really have interoperable legal frameworks. So a law is still very much local and jurisdictional. And so as soon as you get to the cross-border, cross-contextual situation, it's a lot more challenging. There is emerging law in this space. So in Europe, the EIDAS framework is effectively creating that kind of legal operability between member states for the digital ecosystem. The UN through UNCITRAL is doing a similar thing. It largely borrows from the EIDAS model and is trying to also create more interoperability of credentials across borders. There is also sort of domain-specific laws and regulations that emerge. So in financial services, there's obviously a mechanism there for cross-border payments. So I think the law is still, very much a patchwork. And one of the biggest tensions is that these technologies are very much borderless, and yet the laws and regulations are still very much confined to jurisdictions. So we are going to be, as lawyers, challenged, I think, to create a lot more legal interoperability. And that's one of the things that I find really interesting and exciting about this space.
Thanks.
I wanted to comment briefly on Thomas's comment about revocation. In the design of any of these public key systems, and I'm dating back to the same vintage as he is. He was at VeriSign, I was at Valicert. We wrote the OCSP specifications at the time. In designing any of these public key systems, you have a trade-off between freshness and revocation, right? And I think that communities that lean towards freshness on one side as an answer. I don't think that OCSP is going to be an answer here, right? In the end, if there is something to offer, back then there was a concept called CRTs, Certificate Revocation Trees, which was an earlier application of Merkle hash trees. And the reasons for the use of it were don't want to go into that, but it's a possible path to go down. The broader comment I want to make is that in the end, whether we do this with PKI, whether we do this with DLTs, in the end, the underlying technology has to support the semantics of a business that's used to doing business in a certain way. And oddities emerge as you apply these technologies, as it did, for example, with Identiverse, where instead of having a single OCSP hop, you were doing 16 hops on the network initially to satisfy a business requirement. Where do you think we are with all of this DLT stuff in terms of thinking about whether that technology is robust enough to apply to these practical real-world business use cases, given some of the constraints there are?
Yeah, that's actually quite a big question. So just backing up for the audience, so the whole purpose of X509 was a way to bind a legal entity, an individual or an organization to a public key, so that the action you use with the matching private key is you're held accountable, right? So he was describing a number of protocols to solve this. And speed was very important. I think for the DLT, I haven't seen any sort of improvement in terms of performance equivalent to a point-to-point. In fact, I would even say that the internet of today is about 10 times faster than we had in early 2000s, right? Just Netflix, you could have 5 family members watching 5 different shows on Netflix, right? That's the speed we have today. And so in terms of applying it to using DLT for that purpose, there hasn't been any business drivers. This is the key thing. In fact, the largest business driver for X509 in the early 2000s was the corporate sector. It was employees signing emails. It was the CEO signing contracts. In the consumer space, there hasn't been demand. And so until that demand comes back today, we're not going to see anybody trying to push, for replacement of OCSPs with DLT. I don't know if that kind of answers that question.
Partly, I think the other question was really, in the end, revocation may actually be an interesting part of it.
Yeah. So the problem one of the reasons people beat up X509 and CAs all the time, one of the reasons why there is a certificate authority is there's one point where you can revoke, and the CA once revoked it, they will stand in court next to you and say, yes, we did this, we revoked this, right? So it's a practical business requirement, and that's why we have certificate authorities now. Whether or not it's hierarchical, whether you like it or not, the buck has to stop somewhere. The relying party is going to sue somebody. And so I keep telling people, when you sign up for CA service, read the CPS statement, Certificate Practices Statement. The one we did for VeriSign is 104 pages PDF. Since Symantec acquired VeriSign, it's down to 84. We have numbers. If VeriSign loses the private key, there's $10 million maximum liability. If it's an individual low class cert, $10,000. But that's how we got around to doing it. And that's why, now with DIDs and public keys and people using public keys on cryptocurrency networks, this whole thing is going to come back again. And I don't think we have the infrastructure to solve it today.
So unfortunately, the buck has to stop now because we're out of time.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.